So first of all, welcome everybody. I'm Christine Scheckler, the president of the San Diego World Affairs Council, and we're very excited to have two amazing speakers on one of the most timely issues right now. And we're just going to get right into it because we've got two speakers, so we want to have plenty of time to talk to you. And Joe, maybe you can show one or two of those scene setters while I'm just reading the intros. So we're going to have two speakers tonight. The first speaker will be Dr. Richard Nuccio. Over the last decade, Richard Nuccio has played key roles in two countries undergoing dramatic transitions, South Sudan and Myanmar. From 2011 to 2012, he was the National Democratic Institute's, NDI, senior country director based in Juba, South Sudan, during the referendum process that resulted in South Sudan's separation from Sudan after decades of a deadly civil war. We will ask him to come back and talk to us about that. Beginning in 2013, Nuccio participated in Myanmar's guided transition from military rule that led to the release of Nobel laureate Daw Aung San Suu Kyi from decades of house arrest, her election to parliament in 2012, and massive electoral victories by her National League for Democracy, NLD, party in 2015 and 2020. He served in Myanmar as NDI's resident senior director from 2013 to 2016 and returned to Myanmar in 2017 as the team leader of efforts to support the Myanmar Parliament's Public Finance Committee's reform process. He returned from Myanmar in March 2020 and has followed closely the events of February 2021, when Myanmar's military carried out a coup d'etat to prevent the NLD from continuing in power despite their overwhelming success in elections declared free and fair by domestic and international observers. Nuccio spent nearly 2 decades in Washington, D.C. in leadership roles with think tanks such as the Wilson Center, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Roosevelt Center. He was a senior official in the Clinton administration State Department and White House, with special responsibilities for the Guatemalan peace process and the promotion of a democratic transition in Cuba. Nuccio has a Ph.D. in political science and a master's in Latin American studies from Stanford University. He's taught comparative politics and international relations at Williams College, Bennington College, Georgetown University, and the School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, at the Johns Hopkins University. So clap, clap. We are very proud and excited to have Dr. Nuccio with us. And I'm going to go ahead also and read the bio for our second distinguished speaker, Giles Dickenson-Jones. Giles is an applied economist with over a decade of experience working on economic and governance issues across the Asia-Pacific region. Giles started his career at the Australian Federal Treasury, that is Australian Federal Treasury, where he provided advice on taxation policy, economic stimulus measures during the 2008 financial crisis, climate change, and Australia's economic engagement in the Pacific. Since then, he's worked with the Asian Development Bank on identifying the risks posed by climate change to infrastructure, the Institute for Economic and Peace, to understand the cross-country drivers of peace and conflict, and as an economic advisor in Myanmar. Giles started his work in Myanmar in 2014 at Myanmar's Center for Economic and Social Development, where he led teams to develop economic advice aimed at guiding Myanmar's economic and political transition. From 2016 to 2018, Giles worked as the senior economic advisor in Myanmar's parliament, where he worked to support the Public Finance Committee's efforts to drive economic and political reform. Since leaving Myanmar, Giles has worked as an independent economic consultant, keeping a close eye on Myanmar's transition and the military's recent coup d'etat. Giles holds a Master's of Development from the University of Sydney and an honors degree in economics from the University of New England. So with that, I will turn the presentation time over to Dr. Nuccio.
Thanks, Christine. Let me know. I'm a relative novice on Zoom, so let me know if any of you are having problems hearing me or seeing what I'm presenting. I'm very grateful to Christine and the San Diego World Affairs Council for bringing me back together with my my rock and roll bandmate, Giles. We had a very interesting time working together, and I think I don't play to pretend to be an economist even on TV. Giles is a real one, and his contributions to the work that we did in Myanmar were very important and are still being relied upon by many of the young people that we worked with. This talk will probably descend into pessimism at times. Giles and I both have many, many friends in Myanmar who are impacted, affected daily by what is going on there. To my knowledge, at least, no one has lost their life who is a personal friend yet, but towards the end, I'll show you a few photos of people who we don't know the whereabouts of and worry about all the time. So Myanmar is a strategically located country, and it's only the fact that the military held power in Myanmar roughly from 1992 until 2015 that we aren't more aware of Myanmar's importance. I have to remind people sometimes that the Bandung conference that launched the third way, the third world movement, the non-aligned movement, was organized by Burma when it was called Burma. That they contributed one of the early UN Secretary Generals, U Thant. And it's only when the borders closed and the military shut down Myanmar that we lost this understanding of it as a central actor in Southeast Asia. As you can see from this map, it's bordered by very big and very important countries. India, China, Laos, and Thailand all share important borders and have had an important impact on Myanmar's history. Let's see how I can make the slides go. There we go. This is a little bit narrower focus on Myanmar itself. You see Yangon when it was still the capital. This is an old map in the south, that little red dot. Now there is a new capital called Naypyidaw that you will see in other maps that's up in the center of the country. It is a capital that was literally created from nowhere by the military because of their fears and concerns that the Yangon capital was too vulnerable to attack, particularly invasions by the United States, which they shouldn't have been, but were very worried about at one point. This is a little bit more detailed map to give you a sense of the so-called regions and divisions of Myanmar. Roughly, the Bamar part of Myanmar is in the center of the country, a corridor that runs from Yangon in the south to Mandalay and a little bit further north. And the periphery from the north, east, and west are where most of the ethnic non-Bamar ethnic groups live in Myanmar. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. This is probably the iconic photo that, if you've seen any photos of Myanmar, the Shwedagon pagoda. The myth says it's older than Christ. Who knows? But it's an object of extreme worship by all Buddhists, and especially by the Buddhists of Myanmar. After 50 years of military rule, Myanmar began a guided transition in the mid-2000s. It was led by the country's existing military leaders. And the transition was based on a new constitution that I'll talk about a little bit more later. It was eventually adopted in 2008. And that constitution was intended to maintain the military's influence, both economic and political, and especially to limit the influence of what had been the main opposition party to military rule, the National League for Democracy, headed by Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of the founding father of Myanmar's independence. In 2010, the military organized, carefully controlled elections. The NLD refused to participate in those elections, arguing rightly, probably, that they were unlikely to be free and fair. And sure enough, a party, USDP, Union Development and Solidarity Party, created by the military as a kind of political front for them, won a vast victory in that 2010 election. For reasons peculiar to Myanmar, a number of vacancies occurred after the 2011 parliament was inaugurated. And in 2012, there were by-elections. And this should have been an early sign to the military that things weren't going to go exactly the way they had planned. When the NLD decided to participate in the 2012 election, I think there were something like 40 plus seats available to be filled, and the NLD won 99% of them, including in areas that were directly controlled by the military, where military families lived. So it was an early embarrassment that only led to bigger embarrassments for the military and its front party in 2015 and in 2020. Now, the reason I put up this slide of Barack Obama is it was only because of the 2012 participation of the NLD in the electoral process that Obama decided to change the policy of sanctions and isolation that the US had towards Myanmar. And he actually visited the country twice. One of the times, luckily for me, coming to visit a parliamentary resource center that it was my job to establish in Naypyidaw. And this is a picture of he and I, him and me, standing in front of the entrance to that center where he conducted meetings with Aung San Suu Kyi and the leaders of the parliament. This was before the 2015 election. And so the USDP still had hopes that they were going to somehow hold on to power. Sorry, I'm dropping my papers here. This is what happened after 2015. The red dots are NLD, the green dots are the poor USDP party, and the black dots are what are the seats occupied by the military. This is one of the two houses of Parliament, an upper house, which is a bit like our Senate, but not really. It's intended to kind of give more representation to ethnic groups. This is the lower house, the Pituluto. And again, you see the small number of green USDP seats and the 25% assigned to the military in not only the national parliament, but all of the 14 state and region parliaments have 25% of their membership appointed not by the government, but by the commander-in-chief of the military. That same constitution that gave them 25% of the seats also allowed them to control three of the most important ministries and to control many things on the state and local level where they had control over the administrative apparatus that had run Myanmar's local government for many, many years. Part of the reason that the military stayed in power, and part of the reason that it clings to power again, is that it has not only maintained control of key arms of government, but has also controlled much of the country's economic activities. Giles and I used to ride motorcycles in Myanmar. This is one of the 3 or 4 I owned during my time there, parked in front of just a small pile of the huge hardwood logs that are harvested in Myanmar. Under military rule, tons and tons of these resources were exported, smuggled out of the country, and the money put in military's pockets, or in some cases, in their building elaborate structures for government. This is a picture of me outside a very isolated city of Mogok. You may have seen some photos of protesters being killed in Mogok. This is a very beautiful part of Myanmar, and it's where what it says on the right there. It's covered on my screen. I'm not sure if it's covered on yours. It says, "Welcome to Ruby Land," because this is where a lot of Myanmar's precious gems come from. And there are private mines, but there are mines owned and controlled by the military. And there are sales each year. The one just happened again in Naypyidaw that bring tens of millions of dollars in sales of jade and other precious stones to China particularly, but also other countries. I talked a bit about ethnic groups. And despite its losses in 2012 and 2015, the military clung to a myth of its own creation, that it was destined to rule the country, and that it argued to itself and tried to argue to other Myanmar citizens that the army was the only institution that could maintain the kind of national unity in a poor and ethnically divided country. In fact, their 5 decades of military rule had not eliminated the deep regional, national, ethnic, and religious divisions that had been left in Myanmar by its own history, but also by the decades of colonial occupation by the British, who managed Myanmar as a colony from their prize jewel of colonialism, India. Not surprisingly, it's happened in many countries that move from authoritarian rule to more open systems. These divisions were not ended. They were just suppressed during the military rule. And during this guided transition that the military tried to conduct, the new elected democratic leaders after 2015 found themselves confronted by the continuation of decades-old civil wars and new insurgencies based on Buddhist-Muslim conflict, long simmering beneath the surface. One of the things that the British did was rule the ethnic areas, this upside down horseshoe that kind of surrounds central Burma. And they also encouraged Protestant proselytizing in the areas that they controlled in a somewhat different way than the central heartland of Myanmar. So this is from when I went to visit during Christmas, one of the hill stations in one of the ethnic controlled areas, which is majority Christian. And this was a cake that they put out to celebrate Christmas. And as soon as I walked up to it, they started cutting it and giving me pieces. This is a photograph that's very important to me. This is a former MP in Naypyidaw, a former MP in the Yangon Regional Assembly. Sorry, I'm hearing some background noise. Is that okay? Okay. And there I am.
Yeah, I was going to get you back.
Okay. When did I mute out? I'm not sure when that happened. This is a MP, former MP named Unainan Lin. And to get to this very remote village, which they were kind enough to invite us along on, we had to drive for about an hour. We had to take a boat for about an hour. We had to walk through rice paddies for about an hour. And then we finally reached this constituency. You can see just between the microphone and Unainan Lin's left arm, Min Tu, who at the time was the MP who represented this constituency. And he brought Unainan Lin there to talk about the Constitution, something that most Myanmar citizens knew little about, knew that the military had put it in place, but didn't know much more about it. And this photo actually won an award at NDI because Unainan Lin told these youngsters a story about why the Constitution should be important to them, why the military constitution was inadequate, and why one of the things that the NLD had to do when they attained power, and he was sure they would in the future, was to change that constitution. Unainan Lin ran in the 2015 election. He won, but he suffered horrible wounds when he was attacked by a knife-wielding citizen who had been convinced by the military that the NLD would unleash a horde of Muslims into Myanmar if they were to come to power. And so when Unainan Lin was walking through the constituency in Yangon that he would eventually represent, he was attacked and horribly injured. To my knowledge, he still doesn't have full use of his hand because of the attack. Maybe Myanmar NLD should have been more prepared than they were for a coup, because in 2017, the military entered one of the country's poorest states, Rakhine, and conducted a scorched earth campaign against the minority, largely Muslim Rohingya population of Rakhine that drove perhaps as many as 750,000 desperate refugees into neighboring Bangladesh, where they still reside in miserable camps and parenthetically, by the way, form a kind of Gaza Strip now on Myanmar's Bangladesh-India border. It's doubtful that the civilian NLD government was even consulted or informed before the military did this. The military had been conducting scorched earth campaigns in ethnic areas all through the NLD government after 2016. And in truth, the Bamar majority, including many of the senior NLD leadership, probably didn't disagree very much that something needed to be done to put down Muslim agitation in Rakhine. And it was striking to me, and I imagine Giles was shocked by it as well, when after what the UN has properly called an act of genocide committed against the Rohingya people in Myanmar, you would find demonstrations in Yangon with people carrying signs of the senior general, Min Aung Hlaing, Aung San Suu Kyi, and Vladimir Putin. And the reason was that China and Russia came to Myanmar's defense, when the UN criticized them, when the EU criticized them, when the United States criticized the military for their actions in Rakhine State, it did one of the few things to try to rehabilitate the reputation of the military. Maybe it convinced them that they could try to push for even more control than they already had, that they could bully the NLD into giving them even more power than the 2008 Constitution gave them. But when the 2020 election was held, and despite all the money they spent and all the lies they told about the external threats that would sweep over Myanmar if the NLD was elected, the people of Myanmar gave an even larger landslide victory to the NLD in November 2020 than they had in November 2015. From the moment the voting ended in Myanmar last November, they began a campaign to discredit the election as fraudulent and made claims without any meaningful evidence that irregularities should be investigated, that the election's outcomes suspended until the investigation concluded. And the USDP itself called for the election to be canceled and rerun under the supervision of the military. I'm sure hoping that it would produce the good results of 2010 instead of the bad ones of 2015 and 2020. There were international observers in Myanmar despite COVID. The Carter Center, the European Union, and others sent observers. And there were certainly irregularities. There were bad names on voter lists. There were lots of things that were done poorly in the election. But there's absolutely no question that the vast, overwhelming majority of citizens participating in the election chose the NLD to represent them. And the military as an institution, and perhaps General Min Aung Hlaing, his ego would not allow them to accept those results. And so the night before, a new parliament was going to be convened. It's a long story that I don't need to go into, but the parliament forms itself into a kind of electoral college, one of the bad ideas they got from the United States. On February 1st, they would have formed themselves into this kind of electoral college in Myanmar and chosen the president and 2 vice presidents. But before they were able to do that, the military swept through the country, arrested Aung San Suu Kyi, the existing president, the one civilian vice president, and installed the existing military vice president as the new president and suspended all civil liberties and, frankly, all rule of law in Myanmar. This is U Win Taint. U Win Taint is 75 or 76. He always tells me that I'm a young man compared to him because we're 2 or 3 years apart. And the military hates him perhaps more than anyone because he is a graduate of the military's academy in Myanmar, which, by the way, is based on West Point. They actually went to West Point in the 50s and studied how to do a military academy. And he graduated with all 3 of the highest honors that the Academy awards to their best cadet each year. But he then left the military and joined the NLD, and they've never forgiven him. At the time this photo was taken, I was giving him an award for the years he had served as an NLD MP. He didn't run in 2020. And in fact, he had kind of retired. But he has been arrested and detained. His family has no idea where he is. And he suffered 2 heart attacks while he was an MP on the floor of the parliament. So I'm very worried about his well-being. This is Dr. Zaw Mian Aung, who was the chief minister, kind of equivalent of governor of the important region of Mandalay. This is when he was still an MP, and when I probably contributed to his corruption by teaching him about tequila. And so we're sharing a couple of cups of tequila. He and another colleague, a former chief minister of Magway State, are also detained or in hiding at this point. Dr. Zaw is a medical doctor. He spent almost 2 decades as a political prisoner. And I went to visit him in Thailand in 2018 when I myself was hospitalized there, long story, because he has been suffering from leukemia. And again, I'm very worried about him. He's been detained. We have no news of where he is. This is Pion Ketinai, who was one of the incredibly competent young women elected as NLD MPs. She's from one of the most beautiful cities in Myanmar, Kalaw, a hill town, a place that I would be this very time of year. I would have ridden my motorcycle up there because it's the hot and dry season in Myanmar. And Kalaw is at about 4,000 feet, cool, pine trees, great place to hike, delicious food. Pion Ketinai is also in hiding, having to move constantly. I don't know if she's able to be with her husband and young son. She missed them dearly. They were in Yangon. Even when she had to serve as an MP and commute back to Kalaw, which is even further away from Yangon than Naypyidaw. We also don't know where she is. Myanmar's military lives in a bubble of companies and housing and education and healthcare and transportation provided by themselves for themselves. And perhaps that explains why they were so unprepared for the level, intensity, and inventiveness of the resistance to the coup that's being carried out by the people that I just showed you pictures of, and by literally millions of the 55 or so million Myanmar citizens. Perhaps the NLD should have been more prepared for the possible coup than they were, but an enormous number of ordinary citizens have compensated somewhat for any lack of planning by the NLD. Thousands of citizens, dominated by young people, the kind of young people in this picture that was the last group of people that I worked with after Giles had left, and I went back to work for a while again on the budget transparency project that the European Union was holding. Some of these young people may have tried to connect to this talk or may send us questions, but they are living in a country where they fear for their lives every day now. More than 700 people have been killed. Thousands have been detained and imprisoned. There have been dozens of children slaughtered in the streets. And thousands of people are fleeing to India, some to China, some to Thailand, fleeing the violence and trying to find a way to survive. Some are fleeing to the hills to join ethnic armed groups that have been fighting for decades against the central military. And if there's any ray of hope in this situation, it is that the majority Bamar population seems finally to be realizing, at least young people are finally realizing, how their ethnic colleagues and fellow citizens have been treated by the military for all these years. Absent divisions within that military, which have so far not emerged, or action by the UN Security Council, which would likely be blocked by China and Russia, who have taken predictable pro-military stances from the beginning of the coup. Myanmar seems headed for prolonged violence, and it could devolve into a true civil war and put the country on a path toward a failed state at the heart of Southeast Asia. This should be a problem that worries everyone. It especially should be a problem that worries the Myanmar neighbors in Southeast Asia. And on Friday, Myanmar's exiled government announced a new national unity government. This Friday, I believe, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, will hold a Zoom conference to talk about the situation in Myanmar. They have invited the senior general, Min Aung Hlaing, who led the coup. They have not invited the national unity government, at least so far. And I hope that that changes, because it's only with external pressure combined with the internal opposition that there's a hope of rescuing Myanmar from a truly tragic situation. Thanks very much for giving me this time and for your interest in a country a long way away. Thanks very much.
Turn it up on the side. Yeah. I don't think you took your batteries out. Did you take batteries out in both?
So, Rick, thank you so much for your riveting and personal understanding and explanation. And certainly when we get to the Q's and A's, we'll talk a lot more. But many of us have been in those kinds of circumstances where the people that you work so closely with disappear, or worst case, you find out they don't make it. And so, you know, my heart goes out to you and Giles personally as you fear for your colleagues and your friends. So Giles, are you ready to tackle the economic side of this discussion?
Can everybody see that?
Yes. Beautiful.
Okay. So thank you, Richard, for that presentation. It provides excellent context. And also thank you again to the San Diego World Affairs Council for inviting us. As you would have guessed, this is a very personal topic for Richard and I. We have many friends and colleagues and people we love in Myanmar, and for all its complexities and for all the downsides that you see, there's a lot of potential and hope in the country. So the most recent coup has been nothing short of disturbing. So as was kind of talked about before, a lot of the work that I'd done in Myanmar was as an economic advisor. So firstly, I kind of did a lot of work working for a think tank for the former economic advisor to the president. So that was actually when the USDP party, which was the military party, was kind of ruling at the time. I then kind of worked with Richard on our work kind of supporting the NLD parliament. A lot of the time, what I was essentially looking at was more or less trying to piece together the puzzle of how, I guess, the governance system worked, how the economy worked. And that was mainly by kind of talking to people, analyzing data, looking at legislation, and of course, talking to a lot of people in civil society. So a lot of the people, I guess, that Richard and I had the pleasure of working with, they'd already basically given large parts of their lives to, being imprisoned as political prisoners, even before this coup. So it's nothing short of an honor. And I guess that I tend to be the person who defers to my Myanmar colleagues when talking about the Myanmar economy. Unfortunately, many of them aren't available here today, so I'll do my best. So what I intend to do is to more or less give you a very kind of general overview of, I guess, how the Myanmar economy is structured, to kind of talk a bit about what, I guess, the history of Myanmar means for the way the economy has evolved in Myanmar. I'll talk a bit about, kind of how governance has evolved, what has improved since the democratic reforms, and then kind of talk to you a bit about what we know about the economic impacts in the short term of the coup, and of course, what it might spell for the longer term implications for Myanmar's economy. So first, so I guess at the outset, the first thing to talk to is, what Rick kind of talked about before about the military living in a bubble. This is kind of historically how it has been. So essentially you have had an authoritarian government, which is basically ruled from the top down and kind of designed economic policy and the structures of the state to basically benefit a narrow ruling class. What this has kind of meant in practice is basically there's little incentive for a military controlled government to actually do something which is going to enhance the well-being of Myanmar's wider population. Rather, there's kind of a tendency for the military to essentially focus on extracting more and more from the state. So through kind of natural resource extraction, forestry, gems, and even kind of illicit trade. So one of the really key points about this is that there has been historically an underinvestment in kind of key the things that you need, the key ingredients for a peaceful and prosperous society, such as education, healthcare, kind of basic social services, and even kind of basic transport infrastructure. One of the reasons, I guess, when the reforms first happened, a lot of people were very skeptical about whether or not they were legitimate. I guess it's important to it feels as if looking back that it seems very obvious that essentially the reforms were never legitimate. The military always intended to retain control. However, I guess the bigger picture view of a lot of the people I worked with, and I guess me personally, is that I think that the military, essentially, a lot of the initial reforms in 2011, they were legitimate. They had locked in their kind of place in Myanmar's kind of economy and their political environment through the 2008 constitution with their guaranteed place in parliament. And they'd also kind of had a view that essentially they could craft a political future for them, which just was never going to be possible. I mean, during the initial stages of military rule, during the reforms, they actually did do a lot of kind of impressive kind of economic reforms. Besides, of course, the fact they kind of released Aung San Suu Kyi, they amended the election laws to allow kind of a lot more of the preferences of the National League for Democracy to be included in the way the next elections were run. They also kind of floated the exchange rate, which came at a personal cost to the military. They released political prisoners. They invited a lot of former exiles back to the country to be part of reforms and actually gave them senior positions. So I think an important point when talking about the reforms is that I don't think that they were necessarily false reforms. I think that essentially the military just was naive about the wider population's view of what the military's role was in society, and also how they could change that perspective over the longer term. And I guess the other point to make as well is, I guess a lot of the international observers felt similarly. So obviously Hillary Clinton's visit in 2011, Obama's visit in 2012, all of this were kind of symbols of the fact that the international community felt that something had changed. So this looked legitimate. And there's also, of course, John McCain, who had kind of been a long time kind of engager with Myanmar, who had repeatedly tried to return to the country and had felt that the most recent invitation by the military suggested that something was different. And although there was a recognition that there was much to be done, that there was a real sense of optimism there, even if it was with a healthy amount of skepticism. So looking back, I guess, in terms of the changes that have occurred in Myanmar, Myanmar is still a agriculturally dominated economy. So it used to be the rice bowl of Asia. So essentially they were one of the biggest producers of rice in the world and in the region. And unfortunately, because of poor kind of economic planning and policies from the authoritarian regime, they essentially kind of squandered that advantage long ago. But I guess one of the really big points to make is that Myanmar still is dominated by agriculture in terms of employment. However, over the last kind of 10 years, what you have seen is, agriculture as a proportion of kind of economic wealth has made up a lower share, even though employment, the people who are employed by agriculture, is still approximately half of the population. Trade has kind of substantially risen in Myanmar, so it now accounts for a much larger proportion of GDP. And as you would all know, a lot of the trade kind of is with, their regional neighbors. So China and Thailand basically are the two kind of biggest economic partners in the region. One of the points I kind of also wanted to make is that, although again, this reform effort is very much, it's an intergenerational story, rebuilding the trust, rebuilding those economic institutions that you are required to basically build a stable state take time. There are clear signs of progress. So this graph here, it looks like there's a lot on it, but the main story that it kind of tells is, firstly, this is essentially showing the average income of people in Myanmar adjusted for purchasing power compared with those in the United States. And obviously that's because of, where we are today. But the point I want to make is, firstly, there are still major kind of differences in terms of wealth and prosperity. There are still large levels of poverty in Myanmar, but you can kind of see that that gap has kind of improved. So that's those red dots there, which shows you kind of the relative ratio between, America's income and adjusted for purchasing power and Myanmar. This is the same story when you look at Myanmar and their regional partners. So although there's still a long way to go, there was really clear progress there. And you get a similar picture as well when you kind of look at, measures of, for example, corruption or the quality of institutions. So this here is more or less just showing you what has happened in terms of the changes in key institutions in Myanmar, such as the quality of regulation, the level of corruption, how much kind of voice and freedom of speech there is, the rule of law. And of course, you can kind of see that pretty much across all these measures, which we deem as important for a stable society, there's been improvements. Obviously, except political stability and kind of violence and the absence of violence. And this is, of course, mainly because of the increased ethnic tensions and the clearance operations of the Rohingya minority in Rakhine State. But what I think is probably most important to talk about here is that with the reform efforts, there also were substantial improvements in local Myanmar citizens' trust of key institutions, including the Election Commission, including the Parliament, including local administration, but also including the military and the police. So this is, of course, taken before the coup. This is 2019, a comparison between 2015 and 2019. But a real key point here is that, this was a start of a very long journey. But if the military actually wanted to create have a respected role in Myanmar and create a view of themselves as not just authoritarian, extractive overlords, then there was clearly progress there. So this is kind of the context that, gives you a picture of what Myanmar's economy is like. Most people are still kind of, employed in the agriculture sector. There are still a high level of poverty, around a third of the country. And of course, many people don't really have ready access to kind of social services, health, and those kind of support mechanisms that you might need when there's a crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we kind of saw is that although COVID-19, in terms of the health implications, were well kind of controlled and dealt with in Myanmar. So Myanmar, compared to a lot of other countries in the region, had a much lower kind of rate of kind of infections and death rates, mortality rates, as far as we know. The economic implications were quite large. And I guess what we kind of saw was with the larger decrease in global demand and trade, essentially this meant that there was a reduction in employment in Myanmar. We also see saw as, of course, like there were reduced kind of manufacturing activity, which meant that there were a lot of kind of firms which basically shed staff, which resulted in a lot of people kind of losing their jobs, a lot of people not having a lot of kind of savings. And of course, while there was a kind of a lot of closing of borders across the region, you also had a situation where a lot of kind of Myanmar expatriates who would generally send their incomes back home were no longer able to do this. So you had a large decrease in remittances as well. So this is the context before the coup, is that Myanmar was already in a situation which was fragile. There was a lot of people who basically had lost their job. There weren't a lot of savings, poverty had increased, and the best estimates we have suggest that the COVID-19 pandemic for Myanmar reduced GDP growth by about 5%, which basically meant that it was expected that the economy would barely grow in the next year. Kind of, I guess, move forward to now, and what you end up with is a situation where the military kind of probably felt like, firstly, I think that the military, because they lived in such a bubble, they maybe felt that, you know, they had much more popularity than they actually do. And then maybe they also felt as well that, you know, there was a fragility which they could take advantage of in Myanmar. However, clearly they were, in terms of like the absolute, the nature, the inventiveness, and the widespread protests which have kind of arisen, it seems the military was caught by surprise and military is wrong. So this here is a map which basically is recorded kind of armed clashes and protests using kind of the best data we have on this. And the main point I wanted to kind of show and display out of this is the fact that it's not as if these protests are just in one particular region or they're just in urban areas. They're right across the country. And I think maybe one of the important indicators that speaks to this is, of course, as many of you would know, there's been kind of massive boycotts. There's been the civil disobedience movement, which has been still continuing even with the increasing violence from the military. But Myanmar beer, which is kind of the most popular beer in the country, is of course a military kind of produced beer. And as a result of the coup, there of course have been a lot of kind of efforts to basically stop consuming military produce. Myanmar beer, the best estimates suggest that there's been a reduction of Myanmar beer sales between 80 and 90%. So I kind of think that's an important indicator because it kind of, Myanmar beer is so ubiquitous. It is right across the country in Myanmar, and it has completely fallen flat because people obviously, you know, are so against what the military regime has done that they're willing to, you know, really cause damage to the economy if needed. We've also seen kind of more broadly with the civil disobedience campaign that a lot of civil servants have refused to work, including in the education sector, in the rail and transport sector, in the health sector. We have a lot of banks are now closed, despite the military trying to force banks to open. A lot of staff have just basically said that they're not willing to work and not willing to serve the military regime. In response to that, there has been a shortage of cash in Myanmar because of the internet shutdown by the military as well, which is kind of regularly occurring every night until kind of late in the morning. It also has reduced the ability of kind of payments to be transferred by mechanisms such as mobile money, and has reduced the effectiveness of kind of the very limited credit card kind of infrastructure that Myanmar's economy has. So generally, basically, the civil disobedience campaign has clearly kind of disallowed Myanmar's military from basically being able to rule effectively and govern effectively. And if there was a Myanmar, it doesn't seem to be, in effect, ruled by the military as much as they might want to believe otherwise. One of the other, I guess, important examples of this is the COVID-19 vaccine. So Myanmar, of course, is actually has been quite quick off the ranks, kind of getting the vaccine and before a lot of other countries. However, health professionals, many have refused to administer it, and a lot of citizens have refused to take it, despite, of course, the military's pressure. So what this means in terms of actual economic indicators, for the best we can tell, is we've seen cash shortages. We've seen cash shortages, which has meant, firstly, a lot of workers are unable to be paid. It also means a lot of companies aren't able to pay tax to the military regime because they just don't have the money. It also, we've seen a lot of farmers having difficulties basically purchasing inputs, and there's been problems with basically transporting a lot of produce and I guess goods around the country because of the, I guess the wider restrictions placed by the military, which has kind of meant that there's much less connection between markets in Myanmar. And you can kind of see the result of that is that you have kind of rice prices and basic commodity prices fluctuating widely between different areas. And I guess why this matters is that essentially for a lot of people, that's their source of food. And for a lot of farmers, that's their source of income. So that's potentially a major problem. You've also seen, I guess, with these, with this kind of wider economic and political uncertainty, massive, like large reductions in the construction sector. And of course, the infrastructure and investment sector has also seen reductions. And I guess what this kind of speaks to is the fact that you're now seeing a lot of firms as a result of this political instability looking to relocate elsewhere in the region. And that's of course anecdotal, but there is some really good kind of quantitative evidence which kind of supports that whole idea. So looking ahead in terms of what this is going to potentially mean, what I've seen essentially kind of estimates from around a GDP shrinking by 2% to up to 20%. And if I had to guess, I would probably be guessing that the economy would be shrinking in the short term by a significant amount because of the widespread nature of the protests and civil disobedience campaigns. Now, I certainly don't have a crystal ball, and it's a risk for me to pretend that I know what's going to happen next in Myanmar. But I guess one thing which is clear is that the military is unlikely to back down, as are the protesters. So you can kind of see this is a kind of a graph from a relatively recent survey asking about what Myanmar citizens feel about the military's role in the economy and politics. And the main point that I want to make here is that basically there is clearly no support for the military basically being involved in the economy. And there's potentially lots of different reasons for this, but I suspect a lot of this has to do with the simple fact that by the military being involved, by the military rewarding basically economic success through cronyism, it basically shuts out the majority of the population from benefiting from Myanmar's economy. And it's clear that this was true then. And I think that based on how the civil disobedience campaign has kind of evolved, I think it's probably even more true now. What this kind of means, I think, in terms of the future of Myanmar is that we're likely to see a military who's not willing to back down and a civil society which isn't willing to back down be more and more at odds with the citizens in the country. And as kind of Richard talked about before, they live in a bubble. They basically can go to different health facilities, different education facilities, and they can rely on revenues from sources outside of taxation and the citizen kind of the wealth of the citizens. What this kind of suggests is that we're probably, if the military doesn't basically go back to the barracks, see a situation where that division is going to get further. That's going to probably mean there's going to be a refocus back on extractive industries, so more in oil and gas, forestry, and of course, as many of you know, Myanmar is kind of the world's second largest opium producer. So presumably the military will also be looking to kind of ramp up illicit activities, casinos, drugs, methamphetamines. So what you kind of see is certainly in the longer term is a situation where those important aspects of development, such as education and health and social services, will be deprioritized, and a situation where basically the vacuum, the governance vacuum that Myanmar might actually leave in the region is probably going to be, unfortunately, resulting in more instability, refugees, more kind of illicit trade, and not really a situation of sustainable development. Certainly, again, I don't want to hold my reputation on these predictions because nobody really knows what's going to come next. But in general, we do know that, you know, democracies tend to relate in like lower inequality than kind of authoritarian regimes. We know that democracies tend to be wealthier. We also know that democracies tend to invest more in their health and education of the people. So unfortunately, this is it seems like a dire future a dire future for Myanmar, but I guess that I would like to say that this is tinged with hope. I mean, firstly, I think that the response of the civil disobedience movement has just been incredible. Many of these people are, you know, people we worked with, people we kind of, you know, worked for as well. And I guess that as much as the military might feel that they have, by arresting Aung San Suu Kyi and the heads of the National League for Democracy, that they have actually, you know, cut the head off political opposition, I suspect that what is going to actually happen is that we now have, you know, many, many more political leaders have come out of the woodwork because of what the military has done. So for all the Aung San Suu Kyis that we may lose, for all the NLD leaders we may lose, I hope and I'm optimistic that this campaign of disobedience and the protests have meant that actually we've created, you know, Myanmar's society has created a whole new generation of leaders. I guess the other thing I would say in terms of what gives me hope is that there is still a lot of attention being paid to this. And I'd encourage everybody here to, you know, write to your, you know, local representative and keep talking about this, because this is an important issue. It's not just an important issue for Myanmar citizens. It's also an important issue for the region, because with that kind of governance vacuum in one of the areas where basically population growth is going to be the strongest, where most of the world's population is going to be located, one less democracy doesn't bode well, I guess, for the future of the region, but also, I guess, the future of a democratic-led world. Yeah, so I think that's all from me. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Giles, for your also riveting presentation. I'm pretty sure that we all learned, you know, a lot more than we already knew, even if we knew a reasonable amount. I wrote down probably 50 questions myself. I'm going to just start with one because the questions are coming in, but kind of as a USAID governance officer for 27 years, I'm interested in civil society movements and stability, instability, and so forth. And in Rick's presentation, you know, he mentioned specifically NDI, the National Democratic Institute, you know, which USAID works with all the time, as well as IRI, International Republican Institute. NDI and IRI work, you know, all around the world. So both of you, either of you can answer the first question sort of about that, but what role do you think outside powers, including the United States and possibly programs like an NDI, IRI kind of program, what role do you think they've played over the longer, say the last 10 years, maybe even 15 years in Myanmar? And has it been good or not so good? One of you made a comment about, I think it was the Electoral College, and that you said, I believe something like they copied the American model, and or this was a US, you know,
Guilty.
comment, right. So could you sort of address that? So in part, what role does the US have? In case people don't realize, Giles is an Australian. And so I'd be interested, after Rick tackles the US side of this, you know, how does Australia fit in this as well? What is their role and so forth? So Rick, if you want to start with that, and the rest of you, please send your questions in.
Sure. I was very proud to work for NDI, both in South Sudan and in Myanmar. And I think the last time I spoke to your council in person a couple of years ago, I think I may have argued that Myanmar is an example of the small number of countries where US sanctions policy seemed to actually have worked relatively well. the military is very isolated, and they didn't care particularly in their personal capacity about US sanctions, but at least the prior generation of military leaders, all of whom are now out of power, retired, realized that if Myanmar was to continue on the path it was on in the 1990s and 2000s, the outcome was liable to be that they would be a slightly poorer North Korea. That was their future. They were utterly dependent on China, not only for economic reasons, but also armaments, defense, everything depended on China. And China is not viewed well in Asia, and particularly in Myanmar. It's the big brother to the north. It's the empire. China has a long relationship with Myanmar, not all of it positive. And the perception of the average citizen in Myanmar was that the military was selling the national patrimony to China. Dams, the investment in a pipeline to bring gas and oil supplies from the Andaman Sea into southern China, into Yunnan province, as is the case in Africa too. China, sold the cheapest stuff and the worst stuff to Myanmar. So the perception of the military was that if they wanted a different, brighter future for Myanmar, they were going to have to do something about the sanctions. And to do something about the sanctions, they would have to do something about politics. And if you read some of the books that have been written by some of the key figures who led the military transition, they were actually embarrassed. They were capable of being embarrassed when they would go to international read out, really bothered them. I don't think it bothers Min Aung Hlaing, but it bothered some of the previous leaders. So NDI wouldn't have gone into Myanmar unless the NLD had participated in those by-elections in 2012. And, Christine may appreciate this more than most. Obama decided in 2012 to shift US policy. And by October 2012, AID opened up a mission in the US Embassy. For the US government, that's like lightning speed. And by April of 2013, IRI, NDI, and IFAS were on the ground working with the Union Election Commission to try to prepare for the 2015 elections. NDI trained election observers, fielded more than 5,000 domestic observers, Myanmar citizens, all of them. And as I mentioned, started a training facility for parliamentarians. So there were lots of good things going on. I left NDI in 2016, and without getting too much into US politics, I would not have returned to Myanmar with US government funding. And NDI receives funding from various sources, but one of the biggest ones is USAID for Myanmar. And my salary and all the programs I managed for NDI were supported by USAID, as well as the British and the Australians and the Kiwis and so on, but predominantly USAID. When I returned to Myanmar in 2017, where I first met Giles and worked with him, that project was supported by the European Union. And it was managed by various firms or international non-governmental organizations. And so I was happy to return under those circumstances. And US the opinion of the US plunged dramatically after 2017. Again, without getting into too many politics about that, it was an embarrassment as an American to be in Myanmar and hear what was being said about the US administration at the time. But I was lucky. I was able to work for the European Union and wrap myself in the blue and gold flag of the European Union.
We'll have a further discussion about the politics in USAID and NDI at another time, because I
Yes.
think it's a really important story, and it's a story by itself.
But you know, we not meaning me personally, but the US did relatively well. You know, we make a lot of mistakes, but in Myanmar, we mostly did the right things. And we were lucky because the US ambassador at the time, you know, we could have had a used car salesman in Myanmar if a used car salesman had given the right amount of money to Obama. But we had, in fact, a very experienced Asia hand who had worked in the Pentagon and is now the president of NDI. So he knows Myanmar extremely well. And when he was ambassador there, maybe he gave a little bit of favoritism to me as an NDI employee because he had started his professional life as an intern for NDI. Now here he is, the US ambassador working with an NDI mission in Myanmar, as well as lots of other people. So Derek Mitchell was the ambassador at the time, current president of NDI. And he managed a very difficult situation very effectively. And he had a direct line to the president, especially once Obama visited. And then the Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, had a great deal to do with some of the transitional countries like Cuba and also Myanmar. He traveled, came to our Parliamentary Resource Center to talk about what we were doing along with Derek Mitchell. So the US role was an extremely positive one. And we knew when to lift sanctions. There were lots of external groups, including Myanmar exiles, who said that Obama shouldn't have lifted the sanctions when he did. But I agree with what Giles argued in his presentation, which is that at least the previous generation of the military recognized that something had to change, and they weren't going to give up power completely. They weren't going to give up their privilege and their wealth, but they were willing to give up some of the formal political power if the civilians would stay in their place and not try to take away anything from them. And the US accepted that.
About 5 to 10 more really good questions. So can I move on? Because I think it'll feed into what you've been saying. Giles, do you want to make a comment though about Australia's relationship with Myanmar?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I guess there are obviously, because of where we're located, we do have kind of close kind of connections with Myanmar in terms of a lot of Australian citizens have connections with the country. I guess what I would say is that one of the points I was going to make, and I guess Richard kind of talked about this before, was that Australia has kind of been slow to more or less call out what's happening. We actually, there is a legitimately elected government in Myanmar. It's basically the National Unity Government. It exists. They're elected. There are international election observers. That's who should be recognized. However, Australia and a lot of other kind of, I guess, of our allies in the region haven't really called out Myanmar's military or what's happening as much as we should have. And in fact, Australia actually had a conversation with the military because we have one of our citizens there, Sean Tennell, was the economic advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, and he is basically detained by the military. So Australia's government basically were on a call with the military, which the military basically used as propaganda in the New Light of Myanmar, which is the government-run newspaper, to talk about how Australia is re-engaging with Myanmar. So my personal opinion is Australia isn't doing enough. And I think that the US, the UK and the EU, I would love to see basically them pressuring more of the regional allies in the region, such as India, Australia, Japan, Korea, to basically come out and actually make a stand and make a statement, in support of the National Union Unity government.
Okay, can I ask you also a really quick question? So please just give us a really short answer, even though I'd love to talk about it longer. I was counter narcotics, including in Laos. What is the role or how significant is the drug money in keeping this all afloat? I'm just, sort of this, is it a really significant contributor to the military staying in power?
I don't think, I mean, from what I've seen, nobody has hard numbers on it, but I'd say the short answer is yes. One of the issues, I guess, with the Golden Triangle in Myanmar is this is also where there's a lot of ethnic conflict. So along with the drug trade comes more conflict. So I expect that it's a significant kind of revenue source, but it's going to be potentially harder, I'd say, for the military to keep control in these areas.
Not unlike Afghanistan in that regard. Thank you. Okay, let me tackle these questions. So Lulu has asked, has Burma shown the ability to deal with ethnic groups historically, the ability of religious ethnic tolerance? Aside from the military issue, this is the other side of the coin for Burma. So whoever.
Yeah, I mean, I could get into an anti-British colonial rant.
I'm trying to get through 10 questions.
So I won't.
Oh,
but
sorry.
But Myanmar hasn't done any better than the British made things worse, but there were huge problems in Myanmar before. And the grandson, or maybe he's the great grandson at this point of U Thant Mien U, has written several very good books about Myanmar. I recommend them. But he has said, he's starting to say that nothing will be the same after this. That one of the central problems of Myanmar is that they have not defined the nation as an all-inclusive idea. That it doesn't matter what your religion is, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. If you're a Myanmar person, you belong to Myanmar. Under the military, they passed a law that made, Giles may remember better than I do, like 12 different kinds of citizenship. When I would give talks to Myanmar young people and explain that if you are born in the United States, you're an American citizen, they would be dumbfounded. How can that be? And this is part of the problem with the Rohingya. The Rohingya are viewed as interlopers. Somehow they arrived in the 19th century, but nobody invited them. Well, that would be like saying nobody invited the British to New England. They came and they settled. They've been there for 150 years, but they're still not viewed as legitimate citizens of Myanmar. So the Bamar majority in the center of Myanmar seems perhaps to be starting to understand that this is part of what got them in trouble, the country in trouble in the first place. Maybe that will make a difference in a future. As I said, that's kind of the best I can do for a hopeful situation.
I mean, it's worth mentioning as well, just related to that, the committee representing the Pudungsul Lutor, excuse my pronunciation, is, they have started to basically try to forge alliances with some of the ethnic armed groups. So part of that is, of course, I think is going to require a promise to actually make develop and create a true federal democracy. So hopefully a democratic Myanmar in the future will have to be much more inclusive. So I think certainly politically there's an admission that there's a requirement to redefine how Myanmar sees, citizenship and it as a nation, how it plays out. I'm not
You
sure.
may not be the only ones. How does the coup in Myanmar fit into the broader regional competition between the US and China?
Well, I think one of the things that is constraining the West in general, as well as the US, is that big market everybody keeps thinking they're going to grow filthy rich in, and mostly get disappointed that they don't. But China is going to be very resistant to any outside interference, as they would see it, in what they will define as an internal matter that should be managed and resolved by Myanmar. And of course, China would be happy to help them if invited. So they're going to oppose anything in the National Security Council at the UN. They will denounce any outside actors, EU, US, anybody else. And the fact that Biden seems to be continuing something of the hostility to China that Trump doubled down on may make it easier for the US to at least say things that annoy China. But they recognize that any actual action inside Myanmar by the United States would very quickly alarm other regional actors, especially China, but also probably India. Regarding the rest of Asia, democracy has been backsliding everywhere. Thailand has been under a coup for more than 2 years. Malaysia is reinstalling the ancient oligarchs who controlled the country until more recently. We don't need to say much about the Philippines and Duterte. It's not a very good environment. And Indonesia was the one place that people thought could be a model for Myanmar, where the military had controlled things for decades, still has very powerful influence in the country, but kind of left politics to the politicians and felt content to focus on their stature and their military affairs. That doesn't seem to have made a difference in Myanmar, unfortunately. So it's not a good neighborhood right now.
You may have just answered more or less John Schlosser's question, but if there's anything you want to add. So his question was, can you please summarize the reaction of Myanmar's neighbors, particularly China and India, to the coup and the violence that followed? Is there anything more you want to add?
Lots of Indians are unhappy with Modi and his authoritarian tendencies, but both India and China have taken a stand back attitude so far. And I think it's particularly unwise for India, because if armed insurrections develop on Myanmar's northwestern border with India, that's going to cause a lot of problems and potentially even draw India and China into a conflict with each other. So no good news on those fronts, I'm afraid.
Let's see who asked this. Sabod asked, did Western criticism of Suu Kyi over the treatment of the Rohingyas embolden the military?
I'm not sure how you would know that. I mentioned it in my presentation, and I think it's possible. A lot of Bamar people who were sympathetic to the military, even though they may have been Democrats, little d Democrats, were shocked and surprised at the West's and the US and the EU's reaction to what the military did in Rohingya. And Aung San Suu Kyi clearly devalued her stature when she went to defend the military and the military's actions at the World Court. But other than maybe making Min Aung Hlaing think he could push and bully the NLD, I'm not sure it had much more effect than that.